most important assets of a company are their data, right? And so what we're trying to solve is making sure that the access to that data is restricted to only those users who needs that access for some business reason, right? So
Absolutely.
it's not like you have standing privileges just because you belong to a certain group or something like that. It's no long that is no longer considered to be sufficient, right? So what you need is basically a more dynamic kind of way of assessing whether a certain user needs access to a certain piece of data or not. And so you want to go all the way down to like is this data belongs to this customer and this user is working on something related to that particular customer, and so that user needs access to that data.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Identity Jedi Show. We are back, and of course, listen, it's been a little bit. The last thing that you guys saw from me was over in Identiverse. Obviously, Identiverse was a while ago, but I have been busy behind the scenes connecting and making sure that we can get some interviews lined up for you. And today, I am super excited to bring on a special guest onto the podcast. This is my first time meeting this gentleman, but I got to tell this story before I introduce him. Is the reason why we're connected is because I ran into a colleague of a former colleague of mine back when I was at Cellpoint, who's now a working associate there here at Signal. And he was so excited about like the company and what they were doing. Like the level of energy coming off him. He was like, dude, you got to talk to our team. You got to see what we're doing, man. It's so amazing. I was like, all right. I'm in. I want to hear about it. Let's go. So when they reached out, we can make this happen. I was like, let's do it. So I'm super excited to welcome Atul Tushibagule, CTO of SGNL.AI, to the Identity Jedi Show. Thanks for coming, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be on this show.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Signal and what you guys got going on.
Sure. Yeah. So we are a startup that we got started later in 2021. So coming up on 2 years now.
Nice.
We, but our co-founders are serial entrepreneurs. They had a company called Bitium, which was kind of, you can think about it like an Okta, but it
Okay.
was more focused on the Google integration, and Google acquired it, and so it's what is now Google Identity is a large part of what they built, and so
Nice.
the enterprise part of it. So Google
Right.
Cloud Identity, I should say, not all of Google Identity. So, and then I was at Google at the time. I was working with Eric and Scott at the same time in Google, and so when they decided to start a new company, and I was kind of aware of the kind of problems they were thinking about. So it was amazing for me to be able to work with them on this challenge of access management. And so here we are, where Scott led a pretty large team inside of Google trying to solve the access management problem for all of Google. And while the approach that they were taking was somewhat different, what we think Signal is doing is sort of bringing that in a much sort of much more responsive and much more dynamic sort of way to the industry, and that's kind of what Signal is about.
Okay. Awesome. So coming from Google into the startup into 2021, and now going on 2 years out, what would you say is the main use case that you're trying to solve, right? So like you guys said, you're doing something a little bit differently. Access management's been a big problem for a while. We're starting to see a lot of innovation in identity in general around some of the things. So what's the problem you guys are trying to solve, and like what's the unique perspective that you guys are bringing to the market?
Yeah. So I think you can think of the most important assets of a company are their data, right? And so what we're trying to solve is making sure that the access to that data is restricted to only those users who needs that access for some business reason, right? So
Absolutely.
it's not like you have standing privileges just because you belong to a certain group or something like that. It's that is no longer considered to be sufficient, right? So what you need is basically a more dynamic kind of way of assessing whether a certain user needs access to a certain piece of data or not. And so you want to go all the way down to like a, is this data belongs to this customer and this user is working on something related to that particular customer, and so that user needs access to that data. It doesn't matter that you're accessing it at, through the infrastructure or through APIs or through applications or something else. What matters is basically what is the data you're trying to access, right? And so what Signal provides is a platform that can then, implement this dynamic, fine-grained, what we call continuous access management for that data, regardless of whether you're trying to secure your APIs or your applications or, things like your infrastructure access.
Okay, so coming at it from the data level, so let me walk through a use case, and you tell me if I'm
Sure.
correct or where I'm wrong, right? So, all right, so we've got Signal looking at the actual data that somebody's trying to access. So I then go hit an API, and I want to go pull in some, you know, 3 rows from this database, right? Hit the API to go call that data back, and so it's Signal then in real time going, okay, well, this is David, this is the data he's trying to access, and so yes, I'm either going to let the API know that yes, you can have it or not? Like, are you guys there at that level, right? Or are you more at the data level and just going, hey, David's trying to access this. Guess what? No, tell the API to return back nothing.
It's the former. So we are more at the
Okay.
API level, right? So the critical thing here is to understand what that user is doing, right? So it's the context of the access, and at the same time, what is the information about that user that we know from the rest of the systems in the enterprise, right? So what do we know from the CRM system? What do we know from the ticketing system, right? What do we know from HR? From your IDP, your groups and roles and stuff like that, right? So all of these, what we call as systems of record, provide you the information about what is the current activity in the enterprise, right? So that, let's say David is trying to access a certain customer's records through an API. We know that, oh, David is working on this particular case in ServiceNow or Jira, which relates to that customer, and that's why he needs that access, right? And so yeah, David should access that. And so part of this is like, the integration with these systems of record and sort of continuously integrating with them so that anything changes in those systems of record is immediately reflected in those decisions. And because these systems have like varying properties of kind of latency, availability, and all that, we
Yeah.
aggregate all that information continuously into a graph directory, right? And what that graph does for us is two pretty amazing things. One is that it's extremely fast. So we can respond to these queries within like tens of milliseconds, right? And so, our P95 is less than 100 milliseconds. So it's, it's pretty
That's fine.
blazingly,
Yeah.
right? And then the second thing we can do is, because the graph is very expressive, right? It can model your real world relationships very, very accurately, right? It becomes much easier to write policies that people actually understand, right? And so it's typical for an enterprise to say, oh, here's our English language policy. And now let's translate this to like groups and roles and attributes and stuff that nobody really understands, right?
Right.
So instead, what we do is you can actually express those same policies in a language that looks pretty much like English. And you can use reusable snippets, manage it at scale at the enterprise level. And it's something that, maybe you'll need some skill to actually write those policies, but as an auditor or as a compliance officer, you'll be able to read it just like you can read any ordinary, English document, right? With maybe some training about, how
Right.
to go down and how to understand the particular snippets and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, that is a huge leap, because now enterprises can define those policies, enforce them sort of dynamically, and enforce them whether you want to enforce it as an application at a SaaS level, internal applications, APIs, or even if you want to enforce it at the time you're trying to access your infrastructure, right? Like, for example, if you're trying to access an AWS resource, you can use Signal to provide the SAML token working with your IDP, so that we can insert the right labels so that the user accessing AWS has only access to the right resources within AWS, right? So it doesn't matter like at what level you're trying to access that data, right? Your justification comes from your systems of record, and then you are either allowed or not allowed to access the data. Just one more thing I would like to mention is because all this is being centralized, right? All these decisions are coming from the central, signal service, right? The auditing becomes much easier, right? Because now every decision at the time of access is audited, not just
Right.
like, "Oh, this user got access to this data." It's also like, why did they get access, like, or why did they not get access to that data? So producing a compliance report is like super easy, and it doesn't depend on any manual like access certification or those kinds of processes, which could be error prone, right?
Right. That's huge, right? And that's kind of that's one of the next question I was going to ask. But before I got back into that one, so talk to me about like architecture technically, right? So do you guys kind of sit as a policy enforcement point? Like, is there like an agent that you guys sit with the different APIs? Like, how does that work, right? So you centralize where you're defining like the policies and doing the ingestion and the relationships and being able to make the decisions. And then do you call out to like an enforcement point, like an agent that you sit with the APIs, or how does that work?
It's, yeah, just the opposite of what you kind of said, which is, we are the policy decision point, and you can think of us as a kind of a policy in information point, because although we are relying on all these systems of record, we are continuously bringing that information into
Right.
a graph, which is kind of a temporary policy information point. You can think of it like that, right? And so we are the PDP effectively, and then we work with all the PEPs. Like, you can use something like OPA as a PEP and have it call Signal to get an access decision, right?
Nice, nice.
Or you
Okay.
can use a SDK that we provide, which is like the PEP, which then calls our service to get a decision, right? So any of those possibilities are. So we are really just the PDP, and you can say partially a PIP.
Got you. Right. And so you've made it accessible to where other applications can easily call into you to
Yeah,
get those policy decisions. I like
yeah,
it. I like it. Nice. Which, I mean, my mind's automatically going to like different architectures, right? I'm thinking of like, Okta, like their different workflows, what they do with their, different authentication, and they could easily add out to that. You could call in and say, hey, let me call up the Signal, let me do this. So that's nice. Okay. So going back to, so now that you've got this, it's centralized, it makes it kind of easier for compliance and audit because it's centralized. You can kind of see everything. Talk to me like in that aspect, right? Where do you see, if I ask you to put on your future hat and kind of look forward, where do you see identity moving in that case, right? Like as we start to look at compliance, because like one of the things that we're struggling with as an industry, right, and our customers struggle with is that scale, right? I mean, like we just like identities are just exploding. They're everywhere. We got services, we got third parties, we got everything, and then we got cloud infrastructure. So like the days of going past of like, oh, we're going to be able to know every single, like, no, like things are popping up dynamically, so we got to move dynamic. So based on that, right, I think a lot of the things that we see, what I would call like the old school, like I'm not going to use the L word because people get mad at me when I use the L word, but whatever, like they just can't keep up, right? So looking at
yeah,
that, a lot of that we have to change some of our business process and how we look at that. So talk to me
yeah,
about how you guys see the future with that being like, hey, we've got all this in one place for you to make it easier for auditors. Where do you kind of see that going?
yeah. I mean, just at a high level, right? So if you think about the identity space in sort of two kind of broad axes, right? So one axis is sort of is it centralized management or decentralized management, right?
Mm,
So like if it's decentralized, you got to go in each place and make some changes, right? Or if it's centralized, you sort of make the change in one place and then you affect it everywhere, right? That's one axis, right? And in the other axis is it coarse grained or is it fine grained, right? And so what you get with centralization is you can think about it as management efficiency, right? As you centralize more, you're going to get more management efficiency because you don't have to manage different policies in different places. You can just do it all in one place, right? And as you go from coarse grain to fine grain, you get sort of organizational alignment, right? So if you try to define permissions at a very coarse grain level, you're not going to be fully aligned with what the organization wants, right? Whereas if you try to go, very fine grained, you're going to get exactly like what the organization wants, because hey, at this time, Atul is allowed to access this particular piece of data. It's a very fine grained kind of definition. If you're able to get there, you're going to be completely aligned with the organization, right? And so what we believe the future of identity is sort of the right top corner of this sort of landscape, right? Where it is fully centralized and where it is very fine grained. And with fine grained comes the obviously the dynamism is a part of that, right? Because
Right.
those fine grained definitions keep changing all the time, right? So that's it. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, you did. It's for me, I enjoy the time where I have like right now, like and getting a chance to interview, you know, gentlemen like yourself, like and seeing where the different companies are going, and it's nice to be able to like take a step back and just have an unbiased view of everything and where everything's going. I've always been a big proponent of this is where I felt identity needs to go. I think we should have made this push, years ago, but timing's always different. It's always slower than what we want it to as technologists, right? Like, but like it's I think it's as we look at the business and they start to understand and have a better scope of the problem, I think also we got a lot better, I would say, as identity companies and practitioners at understanding the data that's there and being able to actually process it and use that, right? I think we've had this data for decades now, right? All this data, but like being able to properly use it and make something out of it, I think we're really on the cusp of understanding how we can do that. I love the fact that you guys are, bringing all the information into a graph base. I for years I was screaming like we were missing that because it's the relationships of this data that we missed, right? Like we would sign all these entitlements, but like we didn't understand what these entitlements meant. Like, okay, well,
Yeah,
David's got this group and this group, but what does that group do? Like,
yeah,
what is it
yeah,
connected to, and how does it
yeah,
connect to this resource, and what does that
yeah,
mean? Because that's what we're actually trying to renegade. So I'm
yeah,
I'm loving hearing that. I've been hearing it more and more. I know Alex will love this over at Three Edges. I've interviewed him earlier. I love what they're doing with Three Edges, and they're big into like graph and relationships. I really think that is something that this kind of relationship based access, but in general, just understanding access relationships is really going to help propel us in the identity industry to handle a lot of this stuff and do a lot of things more dynamic. And my take on it, and just everybody that's listening to this is my take. This is not signal take. This is not a tool saying this. Is that I honestly think access certifications are going to be dead in the next 2 to 3 years, right? Like the ability for us to understand truly what a user has, like at that moment, what they had and how they got it. Like we can prove that out so much better than sending it to a manager and going, "Does this user have this?" Because I'm telling you, 80% of the time, no, I don't know.
yeah.
Click.
Yeah. I mean, I worry about the risk, right? Because here you are sort of presenting your access certifications to a sort of compliance person. And, what if there was some manager who hasn't done their job, right? Or, did not have the right information to make a good choice. And you somehow it manifests itself in some bad access happening. And here you produce this, access certification report that's saying everything is cool and dandy. And then you see the actual, access, which is sort of countervailing on that, right? And so there's a little bit of risk there. So I completely agree with you that manual access certification process is going to be a challenge in the future.
Yeah, and it's also to add on to it's a point in time,
Yeah,
right? So you come in and say, "Hey, well, at 11:30 on Friday, this is what David had access to. So here you
yeah.
go. We can sign off." And it's like, okay, great. But what does he have access to now? Right?
No.
Like, that's like that was always my biggest,
Yeah,
complaint with these access reviews. I get it. Like you had to do it in compliance. You check the box, but how much value is this actually providing? Like I would feel the auditors would have been demanding, like, okay, but yeah, let me come in now. Like, I
yeah,
drop in on a random Wednesday and go, hey, boom, I want to see an audit. I want to see who's access to what, like, run this certificate. That should be something, like, literally, it should be something the auditor can come in, like, you
yeah,
give them an interface and go, boom, okay. And it says, boom, I'm going to spit it out for you. As of today, right now, here's all the access. Here's why they got it. Here's what's verified. Okay, now we can have it sign off. Like, because access changes and can change so quickly, right? And our identity systems are stuck in this, some of the older ones are stuck in this whole like 24-hour, 48-hour loop of like, oh,
yeah,
I
yeah.
aggregate data.
That's
And so
yeah.
it's,
The propagation delays are painful.
yeah. So, and listen, I get that it's challenging, right? It's a lot of data to kind of consume and do at one time. So, and so that asks me, so I do want to, ask you about that. So you guys have aggregate this data in, so you have your integrations, you connect in. How do you guys how do you guys tackle like, managing that, right? Like, because you're going to have these backend systems that are, sometimes the data is, fresh or older, and that's a lot of data to come and aggregate, so do you guys implement like maybe like it's like a caching feature that you have, or like talk to me a little bit more about how you guys take that data and then, create your relationship graph?
Yeah, I mean, we try to normalize the data right before it gets in, right?
Okay.
And so, you may have overlapping data repositories that are incongruent with each other, right? So you may have a system where there are multiple IDPs in your organization because of acquisitions or whatnot, and you can have a situation where these data sources are overlapping in nature. What Signal does is gives you a very good flexibility of how to map all these nodes to each other. And so you can think of Signal as being a layer over these things, right? So you don't have to consolidate, or you don't have to like do all this pain of putting all these things together in one repository in order for Signal to work, right? We can just take all those things as your data sources. You can map the different attributes in the way you want between them, and then you can write policies on that resulting graph, right? So it becomes much easier than trying to consolidate your identity information, right? and
Yeah.
and just to be clear, the graph is not just about identity information, right? It's your business information, right? So it's about who's working on which case, who has been assigned to which customer, in like a CRM system, or who is a citizen of which country, which is sometimes important to make a decision about what particular data that person has access to, right? At a level of sovereignty related issues and things like that, right? So you don't want this information to be being propagated everywhere, right? So the graph actually
Right.
gives
Right.
you the ability to have everything in one place, and only the decision has to be given to the end system, right? And so the graph is being continuously updated, right? So it doesn't matter that something changes in the system, the source system, it'll get pulled into the graph immediately, right? It doesn't matter of minutes, right? And so there is no there is the mapping part, there is the continuous updates part that make it much easier for you to manage the graph. Than like there's no you don't need to do any data management with Signal, right? Because it's all happening in the source system. We're just making a copy of it, right?
Awesome. Okay. And so what's the as you look at this from your customer side, right? So you guys, 2021, you guys have this idea like, hey, we want to put this together, we want to create this product, right? Now you're growing, you're establishing market fit. Like, what's some of the feedback you're kind of getting from your customers of like, what this is helping them do and solving, right? So this is I'm giving you permission. Brag a little bit about how awesome Signal is and how much your customers love it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Signal approach, once people get it, it becomes like a transformative moment, right? Because it's like they're not used to doing things in this way. And so once they understand that, hey, this is so much simpler, right? I don't have to do all my group management or attribute management in various places, and I don't have to encode all that logic as code in like various applications. There's just one place in which I can do everything. That is the wow moment. The other thing that people are stunned about is like the English language, human readable policies, right?
Yeah.
It is just something that like is so far better than whatever else exists, that people are just totally blown away with it, right? Because I can write a policy that looks pretty much like in English. I can enforce it at enterprise scale. I can manage it at enterprise scale. You can create versions, snippets, reusable stuff, and all that. And yet the whole thing sort of just reads like an English document, right? It's the actual thing that's getting enforced. It's not some like, okay, my policy is that only US citizens who have this particular certification should have access to this data. That's my English language policy. And then it actually means that, oh, this user has to be a part of that group and that other entitlement and whatnot. You're losing the readability over there, right? So Signal makes it much more. So that is another aspect which just people are totally like blown away with, right? So the reception in the market has been amazing, actually, and the fact that it works with APIs, the fact that it works with
Yeah.
applications, internal SaaS, all that. It's just been phenomenal.
That's look, that's awesome. And look, listen, newsflash, who knew? Like users actually want, policies that they can read and understand. Wow,
Yeah.
it only took us, it only took us like 30 years to figure that out.
Yeah.
um, so what question? And I'll, probably a little bit of a leading question. So I apologize. This is, I will be honest. This is kind of some of my bias. I talked with the Strata folks a couple of months ago, right? And what they're doing. I've talked to Jerry, what he's doing with Hexa and their identity orchestration, what they're doing with IDQL, which I think is fantastic, right? And we're seeing like again starting to see like this momentum towards understanding like, hey, let's centralize some of this stuff and make it easier for things to manage because we're starting to accept that hey, people have multiple clouds, they have all this stuff they have to manage, and like trying to manage this one off is just not going to work. What conversations, if any, have you guys had with like IGA tools? Because that's one of the things that I look at. Like IGA tools have a lot of policies they put in SOD policies, all these things, and they sit within that tool and that's it, right? And but they're not very good like runtime and enforcement. So have you guys come across any of those use cases or to the meant that you can talk about, right? So you can tell me, Dave, we can't talk about that, that's fine. But like discussions that you have with those, because I definitely do see that kind of coming into play where IGA and authorization really need to start becoming a little tighter there.
Yeah, totally. And I can talk about it in the customer context, right? So in many of our customers, you end up with like they already have an IGA, tool,
Right.
right? And so that is generally used. They continue to use that for a lot of their sort of use cases. It gives you the coarse-grained access control, and if sort of there is some basic provisioning that needs to be happening, an IGA tool can do that. But when it comes to like this dynamic, fine-grained access control, that's where you need Signal. So it kind of we fit together pretty well, right? And so yeah, it's been great sort of synergy, I would say, with wherever we've ran into these situations.
Awesome. That's good to hear. Listen, I'm a proponent for customers getting better solutions, right? So I love just being that advocate for them and seeing, not only vendors create technologies that are helping them solve problems and number one, making it easier. So I love the fact that, you guys you made it a point to make the policies easier for people to understand and write. Like that's huge, right? One of the things that we've talked about a lot in general overall security is that if we make this too hard for the end user, at the end of the day, they're just going to get around it or they won't use it, right? So it doesn't matter if we make the most secure tool in the world. If they hate it, they're going to go
Yeah.
around it. So we've got to not only solve the problems, right, but we have to be making sure that we're doing it in a way that is easy for them. That is, they'll even say that it's fun for them, right? Like they should get as much joy out of it as we do because we like to nerd out and do stuff, right? We should
Yeah.
be able to bring that same thing to them in a way that they can enjoy it. So listen. I see why Aldo was so stoked. I get it. I'm understanding the hype going around Signal. So I'm rooting for you guys. I'd love to see what you continue to see what you guys are doing and growing out there. So we'll wrap it up with this. Any kind of closing thoughts, like big picture thoughts that you want to give to people about Signal or just about the market of what you see coming?
Yeah, I think as we grow more comfortable with zero trust, I think access control is going to be a super critical, access management is going to be super critical to any organization's success, right? And I think that's key. And I think that with centralization, with fine-grained dynamic, continuous access control, you can have the best sort of organizational alignment as well as the management efficiency to manage these things at scale. And so that's why Signal would make sense. And as we go forward, I would expect these are the things that will power your digital transformations to like the scale that you would like them to, right?
Yeah, awesome. Can agree more. Well, Atul, look, thanks so much for coming on the show. This was like folks. This was a long time coming. It was a couple of weeks. We had a couple of reschedules, but we finally got it together. Tell Aldo I said hello. I miss that
Definitely.
guy. And yeah, we'll be seeing you out on the identity trail. I'm pretty sure we'll run into each other at a conference or something like that. It'll be good to hang out and grab a beer or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, sounds great. And thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Anytime, man. All right, folks, and that's it. That's it for the Identity Jedi Show. Don't forget, you can check out the newsletter, www.theidentitijedi.com. Come see you every week, every Wednesday. You get all the latest news and updates. And then, of course, make sure you are subscribed to Identity Jedi Show, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everywhere you can find the podcast. We are the fastest growing identity news out there and the second best. I'll be honest, we're the second best identity podcast out there. I got to give my love to the Identity at the Center podcast. Those guys, super cool. They're number one, but I'm coming for that spot. So until next time, you guys take care.